This week, the UK government has announced new legislation to exonerate the 900 or so subpostmasters who were wrongfully convicted in the Post Office Horizon scandal. Now, Tom, a lot of people have remarked on the fact that it's taken seemingly forever for these subpostmasters to get any kind of justice. I mean, the first wrongful convictions were in 1999. Attention was brought to the faults of the Horizon IT system in 2003 in the courts. And yet here it is, 2024, it's taken for this to really capture the attention of the political class. I mean, what have you made of that?
I think that's been the number one question, hasn't it, really? Because obviously at this point, it now seems like there is going to be redress. There is going to be an attempt to right the wrongs. Obviously, that's going to be a pretty fraught process, given the fact they're having to pass some quite unprecedented legislation to try and start to deal with this problem. And even so, there will be people who fall through the cracks. But the fact that it took that long, because that's what many of the sub-postmasters will really complain about most, is the fact that this is, in some of their cases, more than a decade, 15 years of their life just completely ruined as a consequence of a computer telling them that they were a thief and the authorities siding with the computer, effectively. It's not to say that it wasn't reported on. I think that's one thing that's worth saying. I mean, Private Eye did some great stuff on it. There was even some numbers people put out, the number of articles that various newspapers have written about it. It wasn't underreported on necessarily. What was fascinating was that it never really caught fire politically. No opposition ever jumped on it. And in the context of the sorts of scandals that we've become accustomed to in recent years, most famously, Boris Johnson, who finally opened the inquiry into this back in 2020, was brought down because he ate cake at the wrong time with the wrong people or whatever. It kind of gives you a sense of how trivial our political class is, or how cut off they are from the people that they're supposed to represent. It seems like it's one of those issues where it combines the fact that it deals with a group of people who are kind of unglamorous as far as the political class and to some extent the media are concerned. These kind of lower middle class, small business people, save enough money to invest in something like their own post office, and then get completely put through the ringer. It's also quite a complicated story. It's not something you can fire off a quick Twitter thread about or do a kind of sassy, social media message or intervention at Prime Minister's questions and get loads of high fives for doing so. It takes a while to explain what has gone on, the backstory and so on. But at the same time, as soon as you explain it to anyone, the profound injustice of it is so apparent. It's incredible that it fell to really just a handful of backbenchers to properly pursue this. But I think it just really speaks to that chasm that exists between what we assume politicians should do, such as righting wrongs like this, taking up issues when their constituents get in contact with them about horrendous things that are taking place, and what they actually do, which is a lot of party political manoeuvring and, as I say, just making sassy interventions in the chamber. But also that kind of sense that people quite understandably kind of assume that things like this really shouldn't happen. Certainly shouldn't happen on the scale in which they're taking place. You had literally hundreds of people in this instance who were having to sort of do battle with this system, a sclerotic legal system, a sort of strange combination of the state and these various companies, no justice whatsoever, people being sent to prison. There was one woman who was sent to prison whilst pregnant. The only evidence against her, supposedly, for this theft was the fact that the computer had said that she'd stolen it. There was no other evidence whatsoever, and yet they didn't believe her. So it's a really damning indictment, definitely, of our politics, to a certain extent on media, but as I say, I don't think they dropped the ball nearly as much as anyone else. And a kind of sense of who really matters in society and what issues matter and how trivial a lot of things have become. I think it's a kind of potent cocktail of a lot of those things.
Yeah, Simon, what have you made of this? I mean, particularly, do you think that the victims are just the wrong kind of victims? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about that.
Well, obviously, at some point, there was a sense they were the wrong kind of victims. But in terms of the ITV drama, of course, they were exactly the right kind of victims, because I think everyone felt an extraordinary sympathy and empathy with them. We watched 3 of the 4 episodes last night, funnily enough, before I knew I was going to be doing this podcast, so that was lucky. And very gripping, very well done, felt very authentic. Most of the casting seemed to have been done to attempt to capture the reality rather than have a sort of Netflix rewrite kind of version of events. And I think both my wife and myself felt quite moved and angry on these people's behalf. It felt very much like the sort of thing you could imagine yourself getting tangled up in. Every so often, I mean, I have on a smaller scale at the moment an ongoing dispute with a private parking contractor, one of these people who catch you overstaying your welcome in a service station, and then start sending you ever-escalating fines before you know what you're doing. There's no one you can reply to. There's a lot of that in the modern world, and I think a lot of people recognise watching that Horizon processing unit sitting under the desk in the post office, sub post office counters, I think, oh God, I've felt a certain kind of anxiety because there are things like that in my life, and you just think if that started to go wrong, I don't know what I would do, and I can imagine it happening. So in a funny way, although it didn't catch light like a plane crash, due to faulty software or air traffic control going down or something, obviously it felt like it was quite local paper kind of territory initially. Actually now it has caught a lot of people's imagination because I think it speaks to a certain kind of anxiety that we all have, that automation is taking over. It's very rarely as accountable as we might like. The helplines are very rarely as helpful as you might hope, and it really could have been any one of us. Yeah, you couldn't totally. It's very relatable. Let's say that, And also, of course, there has been excellent journalism rumbling on in the background. As other people have said, Computer Weekly, funnily enough, deserves some of the credit.
Definitely. And Tom, in terms of sort of political ramifications, it has brought people like Ed Davey and Keir Starmer to a lesser extent into the spotlight. Their roles have been questioned. I mean, should we talk a bit about Ed Davey first of all, particularly as he is someone who is constantly calling for the resignations of anyone else who puts a foot wrong.
Yeah, I believe there was a Times piece the other day which enumerated all the various people he had called to resign over the course of the past 4 or 5 years. It's a very long list, all for the sorts of indiscretions which sort of pale in comparison to what he's being accused of. Now, his defence, and there's probably something in it, is the fact that, I'm only looking at what I'm getting briefed. I mean, doesn't necessarily cover him in glory, but does speak to the fact that because of this relationship that obviously the post office has with the government, given the fact that the government is the sole shareholder and so on, that they were basically just blindly agreeing with everything that was being put before them, even though it's become very clear in recent days that the post office were aware of what was going on. Increasingly, it seems like people, even within government, were aware of what was going on to an extent. There's the other side to it, which has kind of come out today, is the fact that there was one of these sub-postmasters in his own constituency who had tried to contact him at least 3 times and got absolutely nowhere. Meanwhile, his life was just completely falling apart around him. But at the same time, I think it's important that there's an element of scapegoating doesn't creep in, not because I want to stand up for Ed Davey as such an upstanding politician or whatever. It's more the fact that there's this kind of lack of a recognition that this indifference towards these individuals and this indifference to large sections of society and the injustices that they suffer is not limited to Paul Venells at the post office or Ed Davey in Westminster. This is something that is much broader. And I think there's a little bit of a danger that when you have a big blow up like this, people just kind of are ostentatiously outraged about all these issues for a couple of days, and then mistake that for actually having any real social conscience or having any real concern about these issues. I think the worst thing that could possibly happen in this instance is that it does just become a story for a couple of weeks and then it goes away, because it's going to have a very long tail. It's going to be a very messy process, and even then there's going to be a lot of people who won't be properly compensated, if you even can be, for what's going on. So there's obviously a lot of questions that need to be answered. There's a lot of people who have really shown how, for all their kind of lofty talk of public life and the standards to which they seemingly hold other politicians when they supposedly they're kind of fundamentally failing to even stand up for their own constituents. I think it's important that this doesn't just become about this person needs to give back their CBE. We should give Alan Bates a knighthood and everything will be fine. There's obviously a sort of much deeper problem, not just where this particular scandal is coming from, but that general indifference towards ordinary people, which I think has been exposed by this particular scandal.
Yeah, I mean, they solved all banking problems when they sacked that Fred the Shred fella,
Yeah, no, exactly.
Just sack a few people and then move on.